Our speaker, Tom Verde, we're very happy to have back. He's given a number of talks here before. He's a distinguished journalist, and he's lived and traveled all over the world. As his bio programs will say, I'm sorry, I ran out of programs for some of you who came in later. But tonight he's coming close to home, and he's going to talk about how the hurricane of 1938 affected his own family in Rhode Island. We've entitled this series, Good Stories Well Told. That's what you're about to get. Please welcome Tom Verde.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'd like to thank LaGrua for having me back. And as Lori mentioned, for arranging this wonderful atmospheric weather. I mean, I couldn't ask for better weather. As Lori mentioned, I am a journalist, a freelance journalist, which is not exactly an easy way to make a living, I have to tell you. But it's all about storytelling, and that's what I'm here to do tonight, is to tell you a story, which is part of my family's lore and legacy and personal history. And it involves this terrible natural disaster which took so many lives and destroyed so many New England homes, and which began as a hot wind in the Sahara Desert and in the late summer of 1938. But my own connection to it began, as all of your stories began, with our mothers. This is my mother, Catherine Wilhelmina Higgins, who was born in Providence in 1915. This is her when she was about 2 or 3. Her middle name was the feminized form of William, who was one of her uncles. She always told us that her father wanted a boy first, and so he gave her that middle name. And from it, she took the nickname Billy, and that's what she was known by. That was her name, her nickname. That's how she was known for her entire life. She grew up in Providence, as I say, with her younger brother, Hubert, who was the little guy. I don't know if this arrow works. You see that arrow there? Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's Hubert, my Uncle Hubert. Hubert J. Higgins, and Hubert J. Higgins Sr., his father, is back up here. And my mother's mother is Catherine Feely Higgins, standing right here. But my mother was, so there was just 2 children in the family, but they were always surrounded by any number of cousins and what, a very large extended family, whose names she cleverly and assiduously wrote on the backs of many of the photographs that she kept. So we're very fortunate, if there are any genealogists among you out there who've done genealogical work, stuff like this is a real treasure, to have this kind of information. My mother was just diligent about writing this stuff down, and we're all very grateful for that. This picture here, was taken at her home at 152 Irving Avenue in Providence, in a big old Victorian house, which happened to be right across the street from where I spent most of my youth, from the age 7 until I went off to college. And that's one of those only in Rhode Island coincidences you're going to hear tonight. Now, I don't have a lot of information on the Higgins family, but my mother did pass on these and a few other Feely family tree diagrams. Again, to the genealogists here, I'm sure that this is kind of primitive and back of the cocktail napkin sort of thing, but it served us well, and it gives us information and some colorful details, like Bridget Dyer here, who smoked a pipe. I always like that one. And John R. Feely, where are you, John? Here he was, who was a bookkeeper and a penmanship teacher and the stereotypical Irish cop as well. He did a stint as that. So he was obviously a very industrious chap. And my grandmother is down here. Catherine, or Kate Feely, is down at the bottom. Now, by all accounts, she was a lovely, good-natured woman, like my grandfather. They were both very lovely, good-natured people. She had very long, flowing hair, as you can tell. It's kind of piled up on top of her head there. And succumbing to the fashion of the day during the 20s, when women had short, bobbed haircuts, she thought she'd give it a try. And she went out and started to have her hair cut, and she was halfway through it and became horrified by how it looked. And so she told the hair cutter to stop, and she took her hair and piled it back up and just hoped that her husband wouldn't know that she had, because he loved her long hair. And these are the two of them taken before they were married. These photos were taken in 1914. I wish I knew where my grandmother was at that point, but it's a typical Rhode Island, South County home, it looks like. And there they are, the happy couple on the left on their wedding day. Now, my grandfather had his own business, Higgins Manufacturing Company of Providence. And they produced a kind of vegetable shortening made mostly from coconut oil. So he was kind of ahead of his time, really. And it competed in the market with the butter substitute oleomargarine. Now, as our mother told us, oleomargarine at the time was white, and it came in a tub with a little capsule of yellow powder, coloring, that you had to break open and mix in to this white substance, oleomargarine, so that it looked like butter. Well, what my grandfather did, ingeniously, was to invent a product that was already butter colored, and you didn't have to mix in the capsule. As you can tell, this is him at a trade show, and I think it says here, ready for instant table use. No coloring necessary. That was the big deal. You know, it saved you a step. It looked better and probably tasted just as good. And so this unique product drew the attention and the jealous ire of the large Midwestern margarine manufacturers, Armour and Swift and the like, who lobbied for legislation in Congress that would classify his product as oleomargarine, even though it wasn't, and thus impose upon him all kinds of costly regulations. And what they were trying to do was put him out of business, basically. And he went and actually testified before Congress about this, and he fought this all the way to the Supreme Court, and he actually won. However, the legal costs, and then coupled with the Great Depression, it really took a toll on his business financially. But nonetheless, he was able to provide his children with a very comfortable upper middle class lifestyle, which included private school education for my mother, who's on the left here, at the Convent of the Sacred Heart, Elmhurst, which was up on Smith Street in Providence. And I don't know how close, you probably can't read the tuition there, but board and tuition per year was $250. And all the other little added extras, washing and the library fees and whatnot, the amount that it worked out to really was, adjusted for inflation, is today about $5,000 to go there. And he also was able to send her up to summer camp in New Hampshire at Camp Acadia, which was a girls' camp on Lake Winnipesaukee, which closed in 1956. The camp, not the lake, I mean. So throughout her life, my mother remained dedicated to both institutions, Elmhurst and Camp Acadia. I grew up all my life hearing about these places. And she attended every reunion she could, and she kept in close touch with a lot of the old classmates and fellow campers. She could still sing the songs, the camp songs and whatnot. And again, only in Rhode Island, this isn't too hard to do when you practically bump into everybody that you knew as a kid every day. So she also spent many happy days at East Matunic, also called Jerusalem, in South County, enjoying the beach with friends and cousins. And this is my mother here in the hat, in the straw hat. And staying at her parents' cottage, which was located on a dune directly on the beach, right on the beach in East Matunic. It seemed to be a real gathering place for friends and neighbors and relatives. It was a kind of a happy, carefree retreat from the heat of the city and the pressures of the Great Depression. And this is my mother again. She's here on the right, as well as I like to say, the pretty one, right there. And she would come down. She would come down from school. She would come down from Elmhurst. She would get on a bus on Smith Street in Providence, and would take her down to the Central bus station in downtown Providence. And she would ride the bus all the way to Galilee, because the bus wouldn't go to East Matunic, but she would take it down to Galilee, and then she would ask a fisherman to take her across the breachway. He would just give her a ride, and then she would hop off and then be right there to spend the weekend or what have you with her parents. So it was a simple place, as you can see. There were bare studs and had a kind of a camp-like feel to it, though it was outfitted with electricity, as evidenced by the lights that were on the front porch and the refrigerator that you can see here, where my grandfather, who was seated there in the picture, used to keep a glass vial of water filled with fresh bachelor's buttons that he liked to wear in his lapel. And my grandmother is there on the left, seated on the left side of the picture. Now, on the back of this photo are 3 simple words and a date, written in my mother's handwriting. So this picture was taken within weeks, perhaps even days, of the cataclysmic event that would take their lives and impact those of their children and heirs like me forever. Now, this event, of course, was the hurricane that formed on September 9th in the Sahara and moved over to the west coast of Africa and took about 2 weeks to make its furious way across the Atlantic, with wind speeds topping 160 miles per hour. And over the course of 10 days, it steadily gathered strength and slowly tracked to the west-northwest. It's estimated to have reached Category 5 intensity by September 20th, while centered east of the Bahamas. It then veered northward between a high-pressure system to the east and a deep trough of pressure over the Appalachians, which essentially squeezed it between the two systems and intensified its speed. It was almost like if you took a tube of toothpaste and slammed the end of the tube of toothpaste, that kind of pressure built up and it just went shooting right up the coast towards New England. So the hurricane made landfall at Bellport on Long Island between 2 and 3 in the afternoon as a Category 3 storm, winds of 115 miles to 120 miles per hour, enveloping the whole region from Long Island to Maine in wind, waves, and storm surge before finally dissipating over Ontario several days later. What I'd like to show you next, for what happened in those hours and days in between, I'm going to turn to a vintage government newsreel prepared sometime after the hurricane by the WPA. It's about 10 minutes long, but it really gives you a wonderful sense of what was going on, the efforts underway, and the impact of the damage throughout the region. So just sit back. Like I say, it's about 10 minutes.
Of all the signals of the sea, none turns the faces of hardy sailors more grim than the flags that spell hurricane warning. One morning late in September 1938, the dread signal swung aloft along the Florida coast. Up from the West Indies, cradle of hurricanes, moved the Terror, a pit of low atmospheric pressure into which the air rushed from all directions to form a whirling, shrieking vortex of high wind and heavy rain. Hurricane! The Coast Guard watched it warily as it moved northward, paralleling the coast. That night it was off the Carolinas. Next morning it was off Maryland and Delaware, apparently swinging harmlessly out into the Atlantic. But a high-pressure area at sea deflected the hurricane back toward land. September 21st, in mid-afternoon, this tropical terror struck, swept over outer Long Island, swept into thickly settled, highly developed New England, struck with winds roaring 100, 150, almost 200 miles an hour. Tidal waves 30 to 40 feet high struck a section unprepared. The great wind-driven waves swallowed the sandy bulwarks of the coast, washed away the pleasant beaches of Long Island's southern shore, literally changed the coastline. Bridges joining islands to the mainland were destroyed almost instantly. Men risked almost certain death trying to swim to their isolated homes, and the Coast Guard restrained them when it could. Flicking New York City with its outer fringe, the whirling storm smashed full force across Long Island. Thousands of homes along the seashore were shattered, mansion and modest home alike. The storm tore timber from timber, leaving only tangled wreckage. Millions of dollars worth of yachts and pleasure craft were smashed or swept far up on land, damaged beyond repair. Undermined roadbeds derailed trains. Passengers were marooned, some of them drowned. Great radio stations, keys to wireless communication for the continent, went down as the tempest swung across Long Island Sound. Just back of New London's wreck-strewn waterfront, fire broke out in the night, sweeping 4 business blocks. Automobiles were crushed and twisted by falling trees and whirling timbers. Cutting a wide pathway of ruin inward from the sea, the storm piled up property damage in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The quiet dignity of colonial meeting houses was reduced to broken lumber. In one brief hour, part of the ancient beauty that was New England's heritage vanished forever. One of the structures which stood out the storm unharmed is this bathhouse at Scarborough Beach, Rhode Island, built by WPA. Even ocean-going vessels were tossed ashore by mountainous waves flying before the hurricane. Rugged buildings which had stood for decades along the stormy coast collapsed. Northward the tempest swept across Connecticut and Rhode Island, across Massachusetts, into Vermont and New Hampshire, and on to Canada. With communication cut off, the full extent of the disaster was unknown for days. The nation waited fearfully for meager bulletins bearing sad tidings. On the watersheds of New England, the storm brought new torrents to rivers already gorged after 3 days' downpour, and so flood was added to the burden of the hurricane. Sweeping down from their headwaters in the high mountains, swirling rivers rose to levels rivaling the disastrous floods of 1936, increasing the difficulty of removing refugees and of carrying food and help into the stricken area. The great dam at Holyoke was a cascade of thundering water as the torrent poured over its crest. Hartford was one of several cities along the banks of the Connecticut River to be partially inundated by rising waters. An immediate result of the storm was the complete disruption of transportation. Bridges were washed out, roads were blocked. Beneath the water in this low-lying underpass are an automobile and the bodies of its 2 occupants who were trapped. How to get necessary food and medical supplies into the storm zone became a major question. But local relief agencies went into action at once, and the task of rescue began. Neighbor hurried to assist neighbor. Private citizens volunteered to aid police, civic agencies, and the Red Cross. All available boats were drafted into service. Family after family was rescued when rising waters threatened their brief security. True to their tradition of valiant service, the Coast Guard met the emergency with swift action. From the coastal islands, some of which were completely swept by gigantic waves, Coast Guard boats brought survivors to safety. Further inland, armies of workers from private relief agencies, from nearby WPA and NYA projects, from CCC camps, as well as men recruited from every branch of the military and naval services, erected sandbag barriers to halt the rising waters. Were temporary expedients, but elsewhere the rivers were held in check by flood control projects completed by the WPA since the Great Flood of 1936. On the Nashua River at Fitchburg and on the Connecticut River at West Springfield, these new structures proved their value beyond question. In 3 days, an army of 110,000 WPA workers had been shifted to emergency storm and flood duty. Every little man with a pick on this map represents 1,000 workers of the WPA. Manpower turning from regular public improvements and services into the breach in time of dire need. Where tracks remained to carry trains, thousands of these workers came by rail. Shock troops of disaster, someone has called them, because so many times in recent years they have provided the human sinews for great tasks of reconstruction. As the work of salvage began, sailors from Navy yards and soldiers from Army posts aided civilian police in maintaining order. Part of the army of WPA men worked feverishly, helping to locate those trapped or lying dead beneath fallen debris. One man was found alive under 8 feet of wreckage 40 hours after the storm had passed. As New England rallied to the worst disaster of its history, WPA Administrator Harry Hopkins flew from California to Providence, the only transportation in the stricken area. He made a quick tour of the ravaged area to plan with New England leaders the task of cleaning up, as well as the 6-month job of rebuilding public facilities. Administrator Hopkins met with the governors of the storm-torn states, pledging the help of the federal government. Women workers of the WPA, along with the Red Cross, provided comfort for thousands of refugees. At Chicopee, Massachusetts, in an infirmary also built by relief workers, they cared for families left homeless by the storm and provided nourishing meals for children whose own homes had not yet been made habitable. Sewing rooms like this one prepared warm, dry clothes for all the needy. Every emergency unit, local and federal, swung into action to distribute food to the hungry. Trucks were commandeered to deliver food, clothing, and surplus commodities to the entire population in the hurricane district. Food centers throughout the stricken area supplied families with provisions which could not be obtained elsewhere. Convenience centers were set up for the distribution of clothes donated by the Red Cross and those made in the WPA sewing rooms. Many of these badly needed garments were shipped from the sewing rooms of neighboring states outside of the hurricane district. Warm clothing helped to check the danger of serious illness. Stubbornly, the ghastly wreckage of the storm gave way, and the realization came that it would not be days, but months before normal life could be resumed. Women clung pathetically to their household treasures. Men did the heavier work and tried to save what they could. In many towns, like this one in Rhode Island, tons of mud and sand washed over the main highways. All of this had to be cleared away before the paralyzed villages could make any headway toward recovery. Food for these workers was a major task in itself. Every truck not otherwise employed was pressed into service and loaded with food for consignment to various emergency projects. These groups of men working shoulder to shoulder were gathered from every sort of work project, and they stopped their grueling labor only long enough to refuel their systems with sandwiches and coffee. But man needed the help of machinery in his task. Huge sections of broken homes, roofs, whole wings, porches were dragged to open fields to be burned. These were the well-built homes of peaceful New England, destroyed by the awesome power of a tropical hurricane. Every saw in the storm area bit deeply into fallen giants that had been a feature of the beauty of New England. Here youthful NYA and CCC workers vied with older men. Trees were down everywhere, across streets, on telephone and telegraph wires, on houses, and New England could not get going again until they were cleared away. Rivers had roared over their banks in whirling fury during the storm, and now tractors and cranes attempted to guide the streams back into their natural channels. Along the Mohawk Trail in Massachusetts, whole sections of roadbed were washed into the streams below. Workers piled hundreds of tons of dirt into trucks and filled in the danger spots. All over New England were thousands of emergency repairs to be made. Public facilities which must be restored for a resumption of normal living by all the people. A job for manpower. A job once more for the WPA's shock troops of disaster. New England saw them in 1936 fighting flood, just as the people along the Ohio River and the Mississippi saw them in 1937. The call may come from a great drought on the plain or a raging fire in the timberlands. Wherever there is trouble on a heroic scale, there you will find this peaceful army recruited from the ranks of the unemployed, working hard and well with the other agencies of mercy.
So a bit of a Valentine there to the WPA, but I will say that every time I've given this talk many times now, and every time I watch that movie, I'm always impressed by different things. One thing I'm always impressed by are the guys. You know, this is before there were chainsaws, and they had to cut all those trees by hand, with the long band saws. And also, I think it just demonstrates how Americans can come together and work together to address a problem, to address a crisis, and instead of sniping at each other, which seems to happen a lot these days. But in any event, I just think the film is quite valuable in that it gives us a good panoramic sort of idea of what was going on. The hurricane of '38 remains the most powerful and deadliest hurricane in recorded New England history, eclipsed in landfall intensity only by the great colonial hurricane of 1635. So the facts and figures really speak for themselves. Highest wind speeds of 160 miles per hour, fatalities 682 to 800 direct fatalities, more than 57,000 homes destroyed, and damage of $306 million in 1938 dollars, which is over $6 billion worth of damage today in today's currency. Last week I went down to the Stonington Historical Society and grabbed a few photos just to bring it very local, to share a couple of photographs of what was going on here in Stonington, right around the corner. I don't know the exact location. If anybody knows the exact location, sing out. A lot has changed, so it's a little hard to tell, perhaps. But these are right here in town. There's Water Street, living up to its name, right there. And damaged homes, plenty of damaged homes here, certainly, as there were, all up and down the coast. Down in Old Saybrook, by the way, Katharine Hepburn was unfazed, apparently, by the storm, and managed to carry on, perhaps checking out a script there, I'm not sure. But in any event, that's what's going on in Connecticut. But returning to Rhode Island was especially hard hit. Many may be familiar with this famous shot of the Biltmore Hotel in Providence and the level of the storm surge there. So the surge lifted and slammed boats onto city streets and sidewalks, not only in Providence, but here in Barrington, out on Block Island. It blasted Narragansett Pier. It leveled Connecticut. It flooded East Greenwich, as well as Pawcatuck Cove. It shredded the foundations of the U.S. Coast Guard station at Brenton Point. It buckled Ocean Avenue in Newport. And it laid waste to Misquamicut, while utterly destroying much of Westerly and nearby Charlestown, and Quanticottag, and points east. And that brings us back to these people, sitting here on the afternoon of September 21st, 1938, unaware that the storm was about to hit because it turned and sped up the coast so rapidly, and because weather forecasting systems at the time were primitive compared to what we have today. Now, my Uncle Hubert, on the left there, he was there that day, and 16 years old at the time. He told me that the family was in the cottage listening to Neville Chamberlain on the radio, talking about Hitler. Meanwhile, my mother, who was 22 at the time, was, fortunately, she was in Ohio. So she graduated from the Rhode Island School of Design, where she went. She studied interior design, and she got a job at a artificial flower company called CalArt, which is in Pawcatuck, Rhode Island. And her job, quite an enviable job in a way, was that she traveled with a friend who was a fellow RISD classmate, another one of these friends for life. We form friendships for life in Rhode Island. It's very tribal. And anyway, she toured around the country. She would go around the country to all the major department stores, the Gimbels and Macy's and whatnot, and would arrange these artificial flower displays in all the department stores that were provided by Kellogg. They made these plastic flowers. And that was her job. And when she did it, she had to wear this, you can just see it, it's kind of a Dirndl sort of, Bavarian outfit that she had to wear. So in any event, so she was in Ohio doing a job when the storm hit. So I got a lot of details about what happened there at my grandparents' house by interviewing my uncle. And of course, my mother learned a lot of these details as well. But I interviewed my uncle about it too, because I had in mind an essay that I wanted to write for Yankee Magazine. And I'd like to pick up the story by reading portions of that essay to you right now. So my uncle and my grandparents were in the kitchen listening to the radio when suddenly the tide rose right up to the house. Realizing the danger, they left the bungalow and headed down the submerged road. They were rescued by a passing truck, but as they were driving away along an open stretch of road between the angry ocean and a large salt pond, the first tidal wave struck. The driver was blown right out of the window, and the truck flipped over. My grandparents and my uncle all grabbed onto a telephone pole as the wind snapped them in the air like flags. The last words my uncle heard from his mother were, "Take care of your father." Then the next tidal wave hit, and the three were scattered to the wind. My uncle climbed onto the roof of a floating outhouse and was carried in the fierce belly of the storm for 2 miles. He lost consciousness, and when he awoke, all of his clothes, except for his undershorts, had been torn from his body. He made his way to a cottage, and a family took him in like Ishmael pulled from the wreckage of the Pequod. They wrapped him in blankets and gave him some hot gin to drink, while outside the wind howled. A week later, a search party found my grandfather underneath a house, and about a week after that, my grandmother's body was discovered. The man who found her took the diamond ring from her finger and gave it to my mother, who wore it for many years after. It was sadly ironic that my grandparents' house was one of the few left standing on the beach. Though it had been completely turned around on its plumbing, nothing had been disturbed inside the house, not even a dish broken. My grandmother's knitting was on the bed where she had left it. The fish she had been cooking for lunch was still in the frying pan. Inside the refrigerator, in a little glass vial filled with water, was a boutonniere of bachelor buttons that my grandfather liked to wear in his lapel. When my mother came to the little house, she took the vial of flowers, walked out on the long stone breakwater, and gently poured the water and the blossoms into the sea that had claimed the lives of her parents. Now, 45 years later, I found myself, believe it or not, living on that very beach. It was in a house just yards away from where my grandparents' place had been. Now, neither of these is the house, but they're similar, and just a few doors down, close to the spot where their house had been. It was still a place where friends gathered to have fun and enjoy the beach. I used to have a lot of guests, as you can imagine. People would come down because I had a house right on the beach. And what drew me there actually was graduate school. And here comes another one of these only in Rhode Island kind of stories, connections. At the time, I was dating a girl who was the daughter of the president of a department store in Providence, a chain called Gladding's. And this was a source of pride and also a little bit of anxiety to my mother, because she actually had a job working at Gladding's in the gift wrapping department. And so I was dating the president's daughter. It was a big deal. But it was great though. The wrapping, she used to bring home all this great wrapping paper, And as a kid, I remember I got presents, at Christmas or my birthday, and they were always so beautifully wrapped. And you're just ready to tear into them. And the first thing she'd say is, "Save the paper. Don't tear the paper." So you can imagine what this does to a kid who wants to tear open his birthday present, and he has to treat the paper like it's the Shroud of Turin or something, But in any event, I was dating this girl who was the daughter of the president of Gladding's, and living with a friend of mine, and who was also dating a girl. He had dated her forever and ever, and within a month of each other, both of these girls dumped us, and there we were living in this beach house. Now it was towards the winter, and alone on this empty beach, miserable, drinking, and then my buddy, my roommate, was out running on the beach one day, and he wrenched his knee really badly, and he had to go to the hospital for quite a while. He was in there for quite a while. So there I was now, alone in the house, taking care of his dog. So there I was alone, drinking, and it really wasn't very much fun because the dog never picked up the tab, But in any event, I didn't know what I was going to do with myself. I didn't want to hang out in this part of Rhode Island anymore because it's a really small town in a lot of ways, and I figured because my girlfriend took off. She left me for a guy, this big, tall, handsome guy who was a motorcycle racer. I think my car ran on 2 cylinders at the time, and he was, big, tall, blonde-haired guy. One of these guys who makes Robert Redford look like Peter Lorre, I mean, so I didn't want to bump into them, it would be too much. And so I said, I've got to get out of here. What am I going to do? I have to go somewhere. And so there I was, walking. I would walk up and down on the beach there, wondering what my future was going to be. And one day I looked out across the water, and there it was. There it was. It was Block Island, because the Block Island ferry would come back and forth past the house. I was like a few houses down. And I said, I'm going to go to Block Island. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to Block Island. I didn't know what I was going to do. I was an English major, and I figured I'm going to get a job on the newspaper there. They must have a newspaper. So I called up, and I talked my way into a job as a reporter on the newspaper for the summer. And the summer became the fall, and if you've ever been on the fall in Block Island, boy, it's really beautiful. And I was like, I'll go back to grad school maybe in January. Well, by the time January rolled around, I was deeply entrenched in island society and really enjoying my job, although the newspaper couldn't pay me enough full time, so I had to tend bar and do construction, and I would go to sleep in my clothes, my construction clothes, and wake up and go report on things or whatever. I mean, I was working like a dog, but I was really one of the happiest times of my life. But from there, I went to another publisher that owned that paper, had another paper on Nantucket, and he had another one on Montauk, and I just kind of went from there to there to there. And that's how I started my career as a journalist. I didn't go back, and I thought I'd be an English professor. But life gives us twists and turns. And so I ended up, that's how I became a journalist, because my girlfriend dumped me. That's really how it happened. So we never know. We never know how these things are going to work out, right? But before I left that house, I did get a visit from my mother. It was, as I recall, her telling me one of the only times since the hurricane that she had returned to this beach, to this spot. It was a visit that she actually memorialized in a painting that she did. And it wasn't an easy visit for her, as I recall, but she was a courageous woman in matters of the heart. So this woman, this place, this story have come to define me in many ways. We are all the products of our past, even as we take one uncertain step after another into our futures. And I was thinking about I originally prepared this talk for the Rhode Island Genealogical Society that asked me to do it, and when I was putting it together, I was thinking about genealogy in connection with my own story, and it occurred to me that genealogy is more than just trying to contextualize who we are in relation to our our ancestors. It's really a way of reaching out and establishing some measure of contact with people who were gone and who we never knew personally. So a few years ago, I was poking around a used bookstore in Watch Hill, which isn't there anymore, unfortunately, the Book and Tackle, if you recall it. And in the back of the book, this wonderful old bookstore, if you've never been there, it just it seems to recede even further and further into the past as you walk deeper into the store, right? And at the end of it, in the back of it, were all these maps and newspapers where they had all the old magazines and maps and newspapers. And I stumbled upon this newspaper here, this edition of the Providence Journal, dated September 26th, 1938. So I opened it up and I was, of course, drawn to it. And it published a list of the dead and the missing. And I found my grandparents' names there, recorded as missing, just days before their bodies were actually recovered. And so, while neither I nor any of my brothers and sisters ever set eyes upon these two loving individuals who perished so tragically so long ago, I can't exactly say that I never knew them. Because in fact, I've known them all my life, through my mother's stories and through those of my uncle, which my siblings and I have shared and passed along to our children. So my grandparents are not among the dead or the missing, as the Providence Journal declared. They remain very much alive to me because they are and always will be a part of who I am. Thank you very much.